When people struggle, like a regular person thinks about consciousness, what's the first step they take towards realizing like, oh, this isn't quite as simple as what I originally thought?
Yeah, I think in the book, one way to say it is that there's no set of laws or mappings that we currently possess that can tell you what someone is experiencing and why they're experiencing it based off of their brain state. That may sound very surprising, right? Because you may think, well, wait a minute, there's neuroimaging, there's all these things that people do, right? It's like, yes, but that all is just random correlational stuff. None of that is about any sort of like proposed lawful connection between certain neural events and experiences. Maybe to get an intuition about the problem of consciousness, the best way to think about it is, goes all the way back to Leibniz, which is if you kind of zoomed into the brain, right, and you were able to walk around, right, in someone's brain, you would see mechanisms, you would see neurons firing action potentials, you would see dynamics, but there are no experiences there, right? Like you could reasonably say, well, why doesn't this all like go on in the dark with no associated stream of consciousness? Like, what a weird thing. Like, why is there even an associated stream of consciousness at all to this, gray cauliflower, 3-pound cauliflower looking thing? And I think that's a perfectly reasonable question. I mean, there are some people who, don't think that they are conscious or don't seem to believe that there's some sort of problem to be solved. I mean, it becomes a very obvious problem when you talk about things like sudden wake-ups during anesthesia, where you're under anesthesia, you're paralyzed, you can't communicate, and sometimes people wake up because they haven't had enough anesthesia. Now, you're experiencing the pain of surgery, at that time, and that can be a very traumatic thing. But there's like a fact of the matter about whether or not you're experiencing pain, regardless of if you're paralyzed and can't report, or anything like that. So there's some sort of fact of the matter about experiences and whether or not they're present or absent. And there are all sorts of medical cases where that's necessary to know. So, and I think that sort of, but it is a mystery. And I think that, within the novel, which is again operating via this murder mystery of the death of one of these young scientists, which Kirk and Carmen kind of pursue, even that mystery is kind of made more mysterious by its connection to consciousness and the strange events that they experience themselves.
On this podcast, we often talk about like the inner voices that you have, right? So you start a habit of jogging, and then by the third day, you've got a voice that pops up in your head and it says like, nah, man, you worked really hard yesterday. You don't have to do that, right? And then we talked about, like the voice that prompts you to go take action when things are difficult. When you're talking about consciousness, are you talking about these voices, this kind of narrative structure in your mind?
No, because for human consciousness, yes, because we experience the world in a very language forward way. I mean, there's something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is this idea that the language you speak and its certain peculiarities influences how you perceive the world. I think that's probably true to some degree, but not hugely. But it's certainly true that having language versus not changes your conscious experience. But like a dog, I think there's almost no doubt has conscious experience. I mean, it's responsive. It has the same sort of mental states that we have. They can be anxious. They can be angry. They can be happy. They can experience pleasure and pain, like very obviously. And it's that sort of simple sensations that I think are the most perplexing, because there's very little complexity there, right? It's just like, okay, so the dog is experiencing pain because it stepped on a thorn, right? Now the question is, now there's very little higher level cognitive stuff going on, right? But they might be experiencing pain as bad as we experience pain, right? I mean, it might be just as intense or just as dramatic for them. And so the question is then, well, how is it, or why is it, or under what rules is it such that their neural activity is generating or correlated to or the same as this experience? And it's very unclear. Again, like the correspondence there is unknown. But I think, the problem of consciousness can almost be stripped away to just like, why are there sensations at all? Why, like, we have an artificial neural network. Artificial neural networks a single layer artificial neural network can approximate any function. We know that mathematically. Most people would not say that a single layer artificial neural network is conscious. Like, it's one time step where the next bunch of nodes just updates. Yet it can perform almost any function. So the question is kind of like, why aren't we like that? Like why isn't everything going on in the dark? And there are some people who think that we're just fooled about this, and that actually shows up, in the book. Some of the characters, all of the characters, from Kirk to Carmen to many of the other characters, all have a specific view about consciousness, and some are like more horrific and Lovecraftian almost, and some are like beautiful, Carmen is I think kind of deep down like pseudo religious, and very open to spirituality, and so her thoughts about consciousness are often like quite nice. But other characters who maybe think that everyone's just like a biological meat puppet, and there's actually no stream and everyone around them is just confused, well, they can also use that to justify their own actions and justify kind of, their inability to get along with people and stuff like that, because it's just another cellular robot.
I see this being incredibly popular right now, that consciousness is an illusion. So if I were to go out onto Twitter right now and start talking about it, people like Yosha Bach or Lee Cronin would say, no, like your consciousness is it's entirely an illusion. And it's one of those things that's like almost impossible for me to even entertain the idea that my consciousness isn't real. So like, I think there are a lot of people that when they hear somebody say your consciousness is an illusion, they just kind of throw up their hands saying like, how could that even mean anything at all? Because I am aware of myself. So how can you say that this is an illusion?
Yeah, it's just like bad metaphysics versus good science. So bad metaphysics is like Parmenides being, or like Zeno being like, Zeno being like, there's no such thing as motion, right? Because I shoot my arrow at the target, it has to get halfway there, it has to get next there, it has to get another halfway there. So there's an infinite number of steps. So how can the arrow ever reach the target? That's actually, try to come up with an answer to that. Like if you're in a bar and someone like really pushes Zeno's paradox on you, it's actually quite difficult to argue against Zeno's impossibility of motion, right? It's actually a pretty good argument. But of course there's motion, like it's absurd, right? Like it's just like you have this kind of like clever argument that's like obviously untrue, right? And you're denying something that it doesn't even make sense to deny, right? Like if there's no motion, there's no change, how can you even make an argument? Because to make an argument, you have to move through certain steps, right? So, okay, so you can't move through steps. So how did you just make a coherent argument, right? You just sawed off the branch that you're sitting on. It's incoherent. So that's, by the way, probably the quickest and best way to diffuse the Zeno's paradox. So the same thing is true for any of these people, right? Like they're just bad metaphysicians who aren't trusting their own like sense data. Like the number one sense data that you have, the number one piece of incontrovertible empirical evidence that you have is that you are conscious of certain things. So these things are basically them being like, well, maybe we can, I don't quite understand how my stream of consciousness can fit into the material world, which is a metaphysical conception that everything is like atoms and void, right? So they're like, well, I'm Democritus and I can't figure out where this goes, so why don't we just throw this away? This is terrible, terrible, terrible reasoning. But a lot of people do it. I mean, I don't really take it seriously. It's not a serious position in my view, but it's an interesting position, right? And so you know, so again, that's with my like scientist hat on, right? Just being like, no. But from a writer, it's actually a really interesting position, right? Because like, what do you do if you actually believe this? And how does it shape your actions? And also, like, isn't it like really dark? I mean, you know, something that's thrown off in the novel is, I think, someone contemplating, the great filter of like alien civilizations. Like, why haven't we met any aliens? Well, maybe it's because every civilization eventually figures out that it's not actually conscious, and this whole thing has been an illusion, and they all just like kill one another basically, because what's the point, right? You're just left with religious fundamentalists who like won't even pay any attention, and nihilists, right? So it's just terrible. So maybe that explains it, right? Because it's kind of self-canceling. And so anyway, so the writer in me, really likes these sort of positions, but they're bad metaphysics.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.